So we finished with the writing of the new Constitution, and we're on to the first administrations under the new Constitution. That is George Washington and John Adams's administration, and both of them are Federalists. So the first two presidents of the United States are Federalists. So we're going to look at the Federalist Party agenda and the things that they accomplish under Washington and John Adams. So the Federalists were the party that wanted a strong federal government, remember, and the Anti-Federalists were the ones that were looking for stronger states' rights and more of a confederation where the central government was much weaker than the states themselves. And so they saw it this way under the Constitution. So the first two administrations, George Washington was in at presidency for 8 years, and then John Adams would have a 4-year term and be quickly replaced by the leading anti-federalists who would run under the party Republican, a Republican Party agenda, and his name, of course, was Thomas Jefferson. So after Adams, we'll have Thomas Jefferson, but these first two administrations, we want to look at what they achieve. The first thing is the Hamilton program. George Washington was not a strong president in the sense that he was not the one that pushed programs through Congress or bills through Congress. Alexander Hamilton was the individual that did that work for him in a significant way under his administration. So that's why we call under George Washington's administration those things that were accomplished or those things that were made into law, the Hamilton program. So we'll have a look at that. And then the first party system, and strangely enough I'm going to start with the first party system, which I've just described to you. The Federalists were the party for a strong central government, remember? They also wanted a strong economy and that the central government had a role in that. That meant excise taxes, that meant customs duties, that meant the protection of industry at times. And the Republican Democrats were the other party, and they were led by Thomas Jefferson, and they wanted small government, big states' rights defenders. So they hoped that the federal government was small and therefore weak. And so we'll see later in another lecture Thomas Jefferson's administration as the first Republican Democrat president. All right, so let's turn to these Federalists who are looking at a strong federal government. Like I said, Alexander Hamilton was the leading Federalist, so we want a little background on him. I think probably the most interesting quote I've seen about Alexander Hamilton was that he was a man who made modern America. So in other words, his agenda and his programs that he got passed were essential to the building of a strong United States. And you'll see they have a lot to do with the economic strength of the United States. His family were business people from the West Indies, much like Benedict Arnold, right? So they were a family from the North. They had interests in the West Indies. Alexander Hamilton's birth or his legitimacy has been in question, or was always in question. You'll see in your textbook they talk a little bit about that. He could never be president because he wasn't born in the United States himself. And he also had a hard time because they did question publicly the legitimacy of his birth. He was very young. That's the other thing. So at the beginning of the Revolution, he was 19. By the time of the Constitutional Convention, he was approximately 33, 34. and he participated in the Constitutional Convention. So Alexander Hamilton was a very active person in the writing of the new Constitution and then its implementation as the first Secretary of the Treasury. George Washington made him Secretary of the Treasury, and then just a few things that he believed in himself. Obviously, he's a Federalist and he wants a strong federal government. He was very anti-slavery, so part of his agenda was against the whole slave trade itself. He rejected the whole notion of agrarian roots as essential to the citizen body, to the citizen makeup of the United States. That's in direct contradiction to Thomas Jefferson, who believed that the Yeoman farmer was an independent farmer with his own business, his own farm, a small education, was the linchpin to the United States, was the very strength of the United States. Alexander Hamilton rejected that yeoman farmer argument, right? So not necessary to have all these farmers, all the agrarian roots, but to build industry. So Alexander Hamilton was a big defender of policies that would help industry. All right, so 3 things that Alexander Hamilton does. First is he builds up and pays off the federal debt. I'm going to talk about that in a second. He also federal debt. He also well, let's deal with the federal debt first. Number 1, the United States owed, at least to France, $54 million at the time. So he was the one that figured out a way for the U.S. government to pay off the French. They had paid the French back by 1794 or 1795. To do this, they sold bonds to U.S. citizens. Right? So he didn't invent, but he established the sale of federal bonds so that they could raise money to pay off the French, but also so that they could get wealthy people who had an interest in the success of the state. If they bought bonds from the U.S. federal government, then they would have an interest that their bonds would be worth something. So they would have an interest in the success of the United States itself. And that was part of Alexander Hamilton's plan. Let's get, and usually very wealthy people, but the wealthy classes to have an interest in the success of the United States government. He also assumed the state debt that hadn't been paid back. So the states were also in debt to foreign creditors, banks, etc. So he argued to have the state debt assumed by the federal government, and he was successful in this, and they would assume about $21.5 million. They made the deal behind closed doors, however, because some states obviously had paid off their debts and other states had not. And many of the larger states, in fact, had paid off their debts because they had a greater source of income from their own citizens in the state. So places like Virginia had paid off their debt. Hamilton wanted to assume all the debts from the states, and so he wheeled and dealed behind closed doors with these large states that had a big stake and a big interest in the government. And they said, okay, we'll assume the debt from places like Rhode Island, where they couldn't pay it off so easily. And we'll assume the debt, but you will, in the South, put the capital of the United States. So this assumption of the federal debt brought a lot of people who had an interest in the United States being successful. So that was one of Alexander Hamilton's plans, or that was the central plan here. But it also it also located the federal capital in and right near Virginia, and that's how they established Washington, D.C. All right, so the federal debts, or the debts from the states, were assumed. Alexander Hamilton, the second thing he would do was to establish the first U.S. bank, and this is the first time we get an argument over the meaning of the Constitution. So there's two sides to this. There's the Jeffersonian side to the argument that says the federal Constitution has parameters and the states have rights. And Amendment 10, it says that all those powers not given to the given to the federal government and not prohibited to the states belong to the states. So Amendment number 10 gave lots of power to the states, and that was Jefferson's argument, right? That the U.S. Bank was not explicitly defined in the Constitution. We call this a strict constitutionalist argument. So Thomas Jefferson argued there's no clause, there's no writing in the Constitution that says a U.S. bank would be created by the federal government. Alexander Hamilton will counter that argument with an argument for what was necessary for governance. So he said that a U.S. bank was necessary for the United States federal government to exist. Essentially, he's arguing that the federal, or a U.S. bank that was linked to the federal government could be a lender of last resort for the U.S. government and not jeopardize or potentially cause crisis to the U.S. government. So it was necessary. So the very fact that you had a government created by the Constitution implied that there was the power to create a bank that could help to stabilize that government. So Alexander Hamilton makes the implied powers argument, that the power to make the U.S. bank was implied in the Constitution by the very creation of a federal government. Alexander Hamilton won out. The U.S. Treasury was created and a U.S. bank was created in tandem. All right, so now there was a U.S. bank, and it would act as lender of last resort. It would hold the monies of the federal government and so provide those services to the federal government. The last thing that Alexander Hamilton's program does is to create a series of taxes so that the federal government can raise money for itself. So in 1789, they passed a tariff on goods coming into the United States of 8%. So this raised revenue for the federal government, and it also provided the benefit of protecting infant industry in the United States, which had been a struggle with Britain when the colonies existed. Britain was very careful not to allow for manufacturing capabilities to go outside of Britain itself. So Britain had become a hothouse of industrial production in this fashion. And so the United States would start its industrial revolution. Anyways, a tariff can help to protect your infant industry. They also passed an excise tax on whiskey. So an excise tax just means a sales tax on a particular item. So it's not a broad sales tax, but it is a sales tax on a particular item. Now, it happened to cause an uproar in Pennsylvania, because in Pennsylvania there was the Back Hills people that they used whiskey almost as currency. So these people had their own stills and they produced jugs of whiskey, and sometimes they used it basically to barter. They would pay for things with whiskey. So the reason to state that is that whiskey was very important, not just to their households, which they were all, most of them were private independent producers, but that it functioned as a social or an economic instrument so that they could exchange. So it was very important to the western reaches of Pennsylvania. And that whiskey tax was not welcome at all, so they resisted it. The Pennsylvanians eventually marched on Philadelphia against the government, and that was what the Whiskey Rebellion was. The federal government was able to send forces to protect against this Whiskey Rebellion. I think George Washington managed to cobble together some militias from 3 states, and they defended it. But it was just like Shays' Rebellion, it was really an unsettling affair. So this gave incentive for congressmen and gave a lot of support for building the army up, which they did, and then increasing federal strength. So the federal government's power was growing in all this, and you'll see it continues to grow, not just in Federalist administrations, but even under Thomas Jefferson and the Republican administration. All right. At the end of George Washington's time in office, the United States was making a deal with Britain because there was still trouble with Britain. Number one, they were engaging in impressment of American sailors, and the British basically would stop a ship. They would go on, they would say, these men here have deserted from the British military. They would impress them or bring them back onto the British ship, and they had a choice of either joining up with Britain and or serving out a prison sentence. So these young men were being taken off of American merchant marine ships, and many of them weren't British deserters, which is what the accusation usually was. So this was impressment. It was clearly against the rights of the Americans that were being impressed. Some of the soldiers probably were deserters from the British military, but definitely many of them were not. And the British were just taking advantage of a weaker American Navy, American military, a weaker American government, and trying to build up their Navy at the same time. The second thing that the British were doing was making trouble for America from Canada and in the Ohio River Valley region. So the British loyalists in Canada were joining up with Native Americans and fighting with U.S. Army out in the Ohio River region and the Great Lakes region and occupying forts. Your book says 6 forts in the Ohio River Valley region, and that's probably just about right. So they were causing trouble for American Army down there, and obviously America had claimed that the Great Lakes region, or at least the southern part of the Great Lakes region, was part of the United States. So basically this was a conflict over territorial lines. And the United States, John Jay was sent to Europe to deal with Britain, and he made a treaty. And they had some incentive to sign this treaty and get out of the Ohio River Valley region because they had just lost. The British loyalists and the Native Americans lost a battle to the United States at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. And so that battle was significant because it inspired the British to agree to part of the terms of Jay's treaty and attempt to preserve peace. So they said, okay, we will pull out of the Ohio River Valley and out of 6 of the forts in that region. So it was a small attempt to preserve peace. That also had the effect of opening up the Ohio River Valley region for the new U.S. settlement. So United States pioneers started to head out west. And then third, the British agreed that the Americans would be neutrals in the Caribbean, so they wouldn't see America and merchant marines as hostile in the West Indies or in the Caribbean at this time. So John Jay made a treaty that basically settled peace in what we call the Old Northwest, the Ohio River Valley region, and guaranteed neutrality for American merchant marine in the Caribbean. And yet they were very unhappy about this treaty. Americans were. I mean, it was published as giving in to the British, that the British hadn't really admitted wrong, in especially the Northwest, or they said they would cut back on impressment, but they didn't actually do it. So this John Jay's Treaty could be treated as not quite the success that the Federalists would like it to be seen as. And so the treaty was concluded under John Adams's administration, and it was one of the first things that the opponents of the Federalists were able to make John Adams' administration look less than desirable or less than successful. And that would be the whole problem for John Adams and his administration, that the things that were accomplished in diplomacy tended to make his administration not look strong, or not, in the case of the XYZ affair, look honest. Or at least the papers were able to publish it that way, which is an irony because of all the presidents in the United States. John Adams was probably the most fastidious and scrupulous man that we had as a president, right? So the fact that the papers were able to make him, or his opponents were able to make him seem as less than honest is a very strange thing indeed. All right, but what was the XYZ affair? After the Jay Treaty, France, of course, was a little bit upset because it tried the alliance between the French and the United States. And remember, the United States, France had helped the United States in the war against Britain, so there was an alliance and a continuing alliance with France. So they sent diplomats over after the Jay Treaty, just to reassure France in this alliance. And when the diplomats arrived, there were 3 French agents who demanded bribes from them. So the French agents demanded bribes. They did have the names, but the newspapers published them as XYZ. So they said XYZ French agents tried to bribe U.S. agents. This spurred U.S. citizen hostility against France and put the United States in a quasi-war with France. The merchant marine was probably most at stake here, and so there was a lot of tension, and it never really manifested itself into a full war. But the United States then also had incentive to increase its navy, the U.S. federal government. So here you can see, economically, the U.S. government under the Washington administration was increasing its power. After the Whiskey Rebellion, was increasing its power economically. After the Whiskey Rebellion, it increased the army, or the size of the army. After this XYZ affair, they would expand the navy. And the Adams administration then, with all the trouble with France, passed an Alien and Sedition Act. And it was basically directed towards the French in many ways. But let's look at what they are, and then we can talk about the impact, right? Alien Act is a bill or a law about immigration or naturalization. A Sedition Act is a law that defines what can be seen as against the U.S. interest, right, national interest, or threatening to the U.S. national interest. So that's what sedition is. Somebody who commits sedition has done something that has put the national interest at stake, has done some damage. So the Alien Act increased naturalization from 5 years to 14 years for anybody who came into the United States and wanted to be naturalized to become a U.S. citizen. So you could become a U.S. citizen in 5 years before this Alien Act, and it took 14 years after they passed the Alien Act. The Sedition Act said that if you did anything to defame, right, impending government policy, as well as other things, but just talking about or doing anything that would make it difficult or make it seem wrong, bad about U.S. policy. We're talking about and looking at journalists here. So if a paper was going to publish anything critical of U.S. policy or impending U.S. policy, then they could be charged with sedition. John Adams charged, I think, 3 different journalists with the sedition under this act. So in fact, it was aimed at American journalists. All right, so those were the 2 acts. Kentucky decided that this was the moment it wanted to establish states' power, and they passed what were called the Kentucky Resolves. And those Kentucky Resolves, they were actually Kentucky-Virginia Resolves, but they nullified the acts inside of Kentucky itself. So here's the Alien and Sedition Acts. We get the first sedition acts where they are arresting journalists for writing things. But also we see the first effort of a state to nullify a federal law. And that will be a continuing debate and conflict between the state and the federal government all the way up to until today, right? Finally, too, Jeffersonian opposition increased and Jeffersonian support increased amongst Americans. So John Adams, again, had only a 1 term. He's one of the rare presidents that did have only 1 term. And these things tended to make him look not desirable as president, not to mention the fact that he had a very abrasive personality. So he was very oriented towards work, and he was a little bit acerbic and cantankerous, I guess would probably be the best word for John Adams. And so he didn't tend to make too many friends amongst his acquaintances. And then the Jefferson's party, the Republican Democrats, were big critics of the Alien and Sedition Acts, saying, look, the government's trying to get too much power. It's trying to quiet criticism of the government. The XYZ affair, they turned it to look like Adams had welcomed the bribes and bribery. And the Jay Treaty, which was heavily criticized by the papers, was also attributed to him, that it had conceded too much to the English. So that's the first 12 years of the new Constitution. I love this picture. It's about the XYZ affair, and the guy in the middle is a Frenchman who's supposed to represent the current government of France, which was run by 5 executives, believe it or not. And this artist has made them into pirate-looking individuals. So basically, this shows the French in the middle as lawless, and you can see, too, they got the guillotine up on the left-hand corner, and the French image of liberty looking a little bit savage, and the whole idea of the guillotine they're trying to suggest is a savage and barbaric episode in French history, and in fact it was. Not so much for the guillotine itself, but they all knew that people were being tried and executed and not really given due process, as the first 10 amendments guaranteed in the United States. So on the left-hand side, you see the 3 American diplomats that had been bribed by these lawless individuals. So it's a pretty interesting thing. The words coming out of their mouth, the guy in the center with his 5 heads says 5 ideas, but it says money, 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 right? And the Americans say not 6 pence to you.